Up to now, I have avoided talking about JavaScript in the specific context of a web browser. I actually re-recorded this entire course from scratch earlier this month because I started talking about JavaScript in a web browser from like the very first video, and it became obvious that I spent so much time fiddling with the HTML, explaining the DOM, and ultimately I was struggling to get just to talk about JavaScript by itself. And so that's why I took a different tact and re-recorded this. So this time around, as you know, I started with pure unadulterated JavaScript, and now here at the very end of this course, I'm talking about JavaScript and how it's used in a web browser, which there are some peculiarities that I wanted to talk about. And I hope the approach makes sense. I hope that this approach worked for you. And even if this isn't how you wanted to learn JavaScript, I hope you can understand and see the rationale behind it. All right, enough of the pretense. As we start dipping our toe into JavaScript in the web browser, I want to talk about the amazing work of a web browser and how it will actually turn a request by just typing in an address into the point where you're actually viewing a page on screen. I want to talk about how it begins to understand the HTML that it has downloaded, as well as other files like CSS and JavaScript files. And I want to talk about all the things that it has to consider before ultimately rendering a web page out to the end user to see. It's really quite amazing. So let's start at the very beginning. I don't want to talk about all the process of requesting and resolving to an IP address and all that. Let's just speak in very broad terms. There's a request made from the web browser to a server, and ultimately an HTML file will be downloaded, or I should say a collection of HTML is downloaded to the web browser. And then there are references to other resources like CSS files and JavaScript files and things that begin to be downloaded as well. Kind of all this happens really at the same time, along with everything else I'm going to talk about here. And this isn't really intended to be deeply technical. I'm really just going to paraphrase the general order of events because I'm not really privy to what goes on inside of a web browser. Haven't really looked at the source code. But at any rate, while it's downloading all the resources, it has its HTML. Now it's grabbing its CSS. Now it's grabbing its JavaScript. And it's working asynchronously in the meantime with what it does have in hand, in memory, as it's continuing to grab these resources down. Well, while that's going on, the browser is beginning to construct this object-based representation of the HTML elements in the HTML page, and it constructs them into a series of objects that are called nodes. So it'll create a node for a given paragraph, a node for the ID of that paragraph, a node for the class of that class attribute of that paragraph, a node for the text that belongs to that paragraph. You can see where I'm going with this. Everything gets its own little instance of an object, and ultimately it's building this object graph that represents all of these elements, their attributes, and their values, the text values. And so each element node could contain other element nodes as well. So a paragraph could conceivably have some div tags, or probably more likely vice versa. A div tag has a paragraph, a div tag has a header, has an unordered list, which has list items, and so on. All right, so there's just that nature of HTML, and the object model that's being constructed in memory has to consider all those kinds of relationships, as well as the attributes and the text values of each of those attributes. So at any rate, the final result of all that work is this rich object model that represents the document that can also be accessed programmatically. We'll talk about that in just a little bit. But at some point, the browser considers then all the styles that it has downloaded, whether embedded in the HTML page itself or through one or more CSS files that have been downloaded as well. And it also has to consider any of the default styles for elements. So these are ones that are baked right into the web browser. It starts to decide which styles will overwrite the other styles, which values will overwrite the other values. And so now it has to then start to apply those styles to the various nodes inside of this large object graph of node objects. And once it's kind of settled on which styles to apply to each of the individual nodes, it then has to calculate how much space each of those will take up on the web page, all right? So that it can essentially at some point visually render those onto the web page for the end user to view. The next thing that it's going to do is it's going to start to parse through the JavaScript that it's been downloading from various files, and it'll determine what needs to happen and when it needs to happen. So some code can be executed immediately. Some code is attached to the various events of the various nodes in this object graph of nodes that represent the web document. And we're going to see this in a little bit. It'll impact how we write our code and where we write it in the HTML document. So when we're talking about this collection of nodes from a programmatic standpoint, as well as the entire API of the methods and properties that we can access programmatically to change things about the nodes that represent our document, to modify them, to add new nodes, to remove nodes, things of that nature, as well as the web browser as a whole and all of the functionality that it provides to us, like the ability to manipulate things like the history, the console window, and any of the other debugging windows that might be available. Take all of that into consideration, and that is at essence something called the Document Object Model, or the DOM, all right? And so we'll talk about the DOM in the remainder of this video, in the next couple of videos. But eventually, after it's taken all those things into consideration, then it finally will render the page visually to the end user. But its work is not done at that point. Now it's listening for the user's interaction with the various nodes inside of the document. And when the user interacts, it might click or hover or mouse up, mouse down. It might use a keyboard. You know, the user can interact with the various elements on the page in various ways. And if the software developer or the web developer has attached event handlers, functions that should be called in response to those interactions, those events, then the web browser has to say, oh yeah, we have these two functions that we're going to call because the user clicked on this button. Go ahead and execute those two functions now. All right, so when we create those associations, HTML actually gives us a couple of ways to create those associations, but we're going to look at some programmatic only ways to create those associations. We'll talk about that in the next video. But at any rate, as developers, we can also interact with other APIs that are exposed to us. For example, most web browsers expose the console window so that we can write little error messages out like we've been doing up to this point. So we're primarily interested in the document object model as JavaScript developers. Again, it contains an object graph that represents every element, the attributes of those elements, the text that might be associated with those elements, and the relationship between two elements. You know, one might contain the other, or they might be siblings, and so on. Each of these objects are referred to as nodes, as I said earlier. And I just want to make the point really quick that when we're talking about nodes inside of the document object model, that shouldn't be confused with Node.js, the environment that we've been using up to this point to execute our various little JavaScript examples. They're completely different. They have no relationship to each other. All right. So at the highest level, you have the document node, and the document node will contain one or more element nodes, and each of those could contain other element nodes, but each element node will probably have some attribute nodes associated with it, and maybe a text node associated with it. Okay. So the DOM also includes a rich API. So lots of functions that we can call in order to access the various nodes, their attributes, the text, and so on. All right. So we can find a specific node or a collection of nodes that match our criteria. And then once we have a programmatic handle to a given node or multiple nodes, then the API also gives us some functions that we can use to modify the values of those nodes. Everything from changing the text of a node to changing the attributes of the node, like changing the class that is associated with that given node. We can remove nodes, we can add nodes, all that programmatically. The API also allows us, as I mentioned a little bit ago, to associate events that are raised by the web browser, usually because the end user triggered the event with a mouse over, a click, whatever the case might be. As developers, we can associate our functions with those events. And then finally, the API provides some helper functions to perform various things. One that comes to mind is network operations, like being able to call out to another web server to grab data or to grab some other code that can be executed. But finally, there are several ways that we're going to talk about in this video to basically write your JavaScript in a web page or associate your JavaScript with a web page. And if you have professional aspirations, then you should be aware that not all of these techniques are smiled upon. In fact, most of them are frowned upon. There's one that's not. So you might see some examples, and here we'll just add this to our existing page here that I just created randomly in dom-intro.html. And I'm going to create a button, and in that button I'm going to say click me, and then here I'm going to add an on-click equal. I believe we've done this already, right? But I'm just going to write some JavaScript right here. Now, using this technique, I'm able to pop up a box, an alert box in the browser to just kind of execute one little simple line of code. So let me see how I'm going to do this. Let's right-click on this, and let's reveal it in Explorer. And from here, I can double-click it. It should open up my default web browser. I click me, and I get a message box, an alert that pops up with a little message that says hi. Okay. And I can also do something a little bit different. This might be a little bit more akin to what we've been doing, console.log. And I could do hi in the console. All right. And let's just refresh that page. So I'll hit refresh. I'm going to hit F12 on the keyboard. This will allow me to see the console tab. And specifically, I want to look at the logs. When I click the click me button, hi in the console. Okay. So hopefully that all makes sense. Now, using this technique, you're only going to be able to write one line of code at a time. Maybe two, you might have to write some, but there's no doubt that just keep writing a bunch of statements here inside of this on-click event right in line in the button is not a great idea. So your other decision is, or choice is to actually add a script tag, like so. Now, for reasons that I'll explain a little bit later, typically you don't see script tags added there. You would probably want to put them at the bottom of the document. And the reason is pretty simple, that the web browser is going to look at the code line by line, and if it encounters a script tag up here and we reference elements in the body, those elements may not have been loaded yet into the document object model. If we put the script at the very end, we can ensure that everything above this has been loaded already, so we can reference the various elements in our HTML, all right, or the various nodes in our document object model, to say it in a more programmer-friendly way. Okay, so here's what we can do instead. I can actually create a function. Let's call this just a click handler. And, I could even just add message. And here I can just do something like console.log hi, and then maybe ... and then maybe a message like that. So now in the on-click, I can kind of wire this up and say, hey, call click handler, and I'll just say from the button click event. All right, so we'll save all that, and with any luck, you can see where we make the call to the function we've created, and then passing in a message, which should display in the console log. Let's open up our web browser again. Let's refresh this page, F5. I'm going to click the click me button, and we get hi ... from the button click event. All right. So you might be wondering, well, wait a second. You are calling a function before it is defined in your JavaScript. Isn't that a problem? No, and this is something I wanted to talk about before, but never really got a chance to, and this applies whenever we're executing all of our examples in Node. Function declarations are hoisted to the very kind of top of the execution environment. So the JavaScript compiler will go through and look for all the function declarations. It'll put them at the top. It knows where they're at now, and then it will continue to execute any additional code. So this is, in essence, added then to the top of the execution chain. So by the time we get to the click event handler for this button, JavaScript's already very aware that this function exists. All right, so small point there. But these techniques of using this on-click equal and the script tag in this manner, these are generally frowned upon professionally. You probably want to do what's called separate your concerns. So your JavaScript it might be more appropriate to keep it in its own file and to kind of remove all of these references like this, like we have there. So I'm going to say, don't write JavaScript in your HTML page. All right. And some people might argue with that and say it's perfectly fine. And, you know, it just depends on how much JavaScript there is and what your professional aspirations are and the other programmers and what they're doing in your group. But generally speaking, what you want to do is kind of just add your code to another file. In this case, I'm going to create another file. I'm going to call this domintro.js, right? And then what we're going to do is actually wire up the event handler to the button click event, but we're going to wire it up in our code. So what we're going to do to start off with is to create an iffy. So remember how to do that? We're going to create function. I'm going to wrap it in a parenthesis, and then we're going to say execute immediately. All right. And in here, what we'll do is we'll define our function, or the click handler, and then I'm also going to, let's go here to our domintro.html. I'm going to give this guy an ID, and I'm going to say your ID is my button. All right. In fact, I hope you don't mind that I'm going to delete all of this out of here. All right, and I'm going to delete all of this out of here. It's gone now. And I'm going to go into the domintro.js. And the first thing I need to do is get a reference to my button, all right, or my button. So what we'll do is let my button equal document dot get element by ID, and then give it the ID I want, my button. All right. Next thing I want to do is go my button, add event listener. I'm going to say which event I want to listen to. In this case, I want to listen to the click event. And when that happens, I want to call click handler. And I guess I could pass in a message if I wanted to at this point. So hi from my iffy, right? Now I need to go back to the domintro.html. Here I'm going to add a script tag like so, script type equals text /JavaScript. Source equals, and then we'll give it the name domintro.js, like so. Save that. And now, hopefully, let's load this guy up, refresh, and you can see I did something incorrect. Let's go back here. Let's get rid of all of this business right there. All right, now we don't want to call that method just yet. We just want to wire it up to the button and say whenever the click, we want to listen for the click event. When that happens, then we want you to execute click handler. All right. All right. Now that we have that in place, let's go ahead and refresh. click me, and there we go. Now we get pointer event, not exactly what I was looking for. If it's really important to us to pass in the message, which I actually forgot about, sorry, what I'll do is just kind of wrap this call inside of a function expression. So we'll go function, like so, and inside there we'll make the call like that. And then hi from iffy. All right, that should work, hopefully. So let's save it. Let's try that again. There we go. That is what I wanted to happen. Okay, so had a lot to say in this video about the DOM and about how to attach your JavaScript into a web page and still access the various elements of the document object model or this document object by using helper methods like getElementById, passing in the ID, and now getting a programmatic reference, which we can then use to add or even remove event handlers to. In this case, I'm just adding a function expression to make a call into another function that I created earlier. All right, hopefully all that makes sense, and we can continue on in the next lesson and kind of expand on this. All right, we'll see you there. Thanks.